The rain fell in sheets that November afternoon, turning the streets of Philadelphia's Fairmount neighborhood into rivers of reflected neon and brake lights. Amelia Taylor stood at the window of her second-floor apartment, watching water cascade down the glass in patterns that reminded her of tears. Her hands trembled around the ceramic mug, the one with the chipped handle that her daughter had given her 3 Christmases ago, now filled with tea gone cold. Behind her, the television murmured with breaking news, but she couldn't turn around, couldn't face what they were saying, couldn't reconcile the words suspect and arrested with the face they kept showing on the screen. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Her face. The knock came at 6:47 p.m. She knew because she'd been staring at the clock, watching the minutes crawl by like wounded animals. Detective Marcus Chin stood in the hallway with his partner, a younger woman named Rodriguez whose eyes held more sympathy than Amelia could bear. Marcus had kind eyes, the sort that crinkled at the corners when he smiled, but he wasn't smiling now. He held his badge like a shield between them. "Miss Taylor," he said, and his voice carried the weight of 18 years. "We need you to come with us. There are questions about the Riverside Elementary incident, about what happened in 2005. Amelia's neighbor, Mrs. Okoye, emerged from the adjacent apartment, her house dress still dusted with flour from the bread she baked every Wednesday. The elderly Nigerian woman had lived next door for a decade, had watched Amelia's daughter grow from a sullen teenager into a bright college student, had shared countless cups of coffee across their adjoining kitchen tables. Now her face registered confusion, then disbelief, then something worse, doubt. "Amelia," Mrs. Okoye's accent thickened with emotion. "What is this?" But Amelia had no words. She set down the mug carefully on the windowsill next to the small jade plant she'd been nursing back to health for months, its leaves finally turning from yellow to green. She'd named it Hope, silly as that seemed. She wondered if anyone would water it while she was gone. The police station smelled of burnt coffee and desperation, a scent Amelia recognized from the years she'd spent volunteering with the Community Legal Aid Center. She'd sat in rooms like this before, but always on the other side of the table, always as the helper, never as the accused. The interrogation room was smaller than it looked on television, the walls a sickly green that seemed to pulse under the fluorescent lights. Detective Chun sat across from her, a manila folder thick with papers spread between them like a barrier. "I need you to understand something," he began, his voice measured and careful. "This isn't about what we think we know. This is about what the evidence shows. And Ms. Taylor, the evidence is substantial." Rodriguez leaned forward, her dark hair pulled back tight enough to make Amelia's scalp ache in sympathy. "In 2005, you were a substitute teacher at Riverside Elementary, 3rd grade. You were there the day that Benjamin Morrison went missing." The name hit Amelia like a physical blow. Benjamin Morrison, 7 years old, gap-toothed smile, obsessed with dinosaurs and asked questions that would exhaust 3 teachers in a row. She remembered him. God, how could she forget? He'd been in her class for 3 weeks while his regular teacher recovered from surgery. 3 weeks of watching him struggle to read aloud, of seeing the other children whisper and laugh, of knowing something was deeply wrong but not knowing what or how to help. "I gave my statement," Amelia said, and her voice sounded strange to her own ears, distant and hollow. 18 years ago, I told them everything I knew, everything I saw. Tell us again." Chen's pen hovered over a yellow legal pad, ready to record, to judge, to condemn. So she did. She told them about that October afternoon when the air had smelled of fallen leaves and approaching winter, about how Benjamin had seemed distracted during reading time, kept glancing toward the windows that overlooked the parking lot, about the fire drill that wasn't a fire drill, the confusion in the hallways, children streaming toward exits in uneven lines, about how she'd counted her students once, twice, 3 times and come up 1 short. Benjamin. She told them about the search that followed, frantic teachers checking bathrooms and closets and the cafeteria, about calling his name until her voice went hoarse, about the moment when someone finally called the police, when the situation transformed from missing student to something darker, more permanent, more unforgivable. "You were the last person to see him," Rodriguez said, "and it wasn't a question." "One of many," Amelia corrected. "There were 23 other students in that classroom. There was the PE teacher in the hallway. There was. But you were his teacher that day." Chen's voice hardened slightly, a subtle shift that made the air feel thinner. "You were responsible for him." Amelia's hands clenched in her lap. She thought of her own daughter, Zara, who'd been 12 that year, already starting to pull away into the private world of adolescence. She thought of how fierce her love for that child had been, how protective. How could anyone believe she would harm someone else's son? "What's changed?" she asked. "Why now, after 18 years? The detectives exchanged a glance, and in that momentary silence, Amelia heard the future crumbling. Chun opened the folder and withdrew a photograph. It showed a blue backpack, small and worn, with a dinosaur patch sewn onto the front pocket. Benjamin's backpack, the one that had never been found. "This was discovered 3 days ago during a renovation project," Chun said quietly. "In the basement of your former apartment building on Watkins Street. The building where you lived in 2005. The room tilted. Amelia gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white. "That's impossible. I moved out of that building in 2007. I haven't been back there in over 15 years. DNA evidence was recovered from inside the backpack," Rodriguez continued, her tone clinical, detached. "Hair follicles, fibers from clothing. And Ms. Taylor, some of those fibers match items confiscated from your current residence." "What items?" Amelia's voice rose, panic threading through each word. "A blue cardigan, the one hanging in your closet with the buttons missing." Amelia remembered that cardigan. She'd worn it constantly in those early teaching years, before she'd given up on education and moved into administrative work at the nonprofit. It was comfortable, safe, the sort of garment that became invisible through familiarity. She'd kept it all these years not out of sentimentality but out of simple inertia. It still fit, still kept her warm on chilly evenings. "This is insane," she whispered. "I didn't hurt that boy. I would never." "Then help us understand," Chan interrupted, leaning forward with an intensity that made Amelia shrink back. "Help us understand how his backpack ended up in your building. How your clothing fibers ended up inside it. Help us understand the timeline, Miss Taylor, because right now it doesn't look good." Outside the interrogation room, Amelia could hear voices, phones ringing, the ordinary sounds of a police station processing the daily tide of human suffering. She wondered if anyone out there believed in her innocence. If anyone would stand beside her when this story broke wide open, when her name became synonymous with every parent's worst nightmare. The question hung in the air between them, unanswered and unanswerable. How does an innocent woman prove she didn't commit a crime when all the evidence says she did? Amelia's life before that November evening had been built on small, careful routines, the kind that keep a person upright when everything else threatens to collapse. Every morning at 6:15 a.m., she would wake to the sound of her alarm, an old-fashioned clock radio that played soft jazz instead of harsh beeping. She'd inherited it from her mother, along with the tendency to wake before the alarm actually went off, lying in the pre-dawn darkness and mentally preparing for the day ahead. Her apartment was modest but warm. Filled with second-hand furniture, she'd refinished herself and plants that required more attention than she probably should have given them. The jade plant by the window was just one of many. There were ferns in the bathroom, a snake plant by the bookshelf, herbs growing in recycled containers on the kitchen counter. Zara used to tease her about it, calling the apartment the greenhouse, and pretending to need a machete to navigate through the living room. Zara. Her daughter had been the center of Amelia's universe since the day she'd been born 25 years ago. A squalling, red-faced miracle that had arrived when Amelia was just 23 and terrified. The father, a boyfriend who'd seemed charming until he wasn't, had disappeared before the pregnancy test dried. Amelia had finished college with a baby on her hip, worked 3 jobs to pay for childcare, and somehow impossibly made it work. Now Zara was in graduate school in Boston, studying environmental science and calling twice a week with updates about her research and complaints about her roommate and questions about whether Amelia was eating enough vegetables. Those calls were lifelines, reminders that Amelia had done something right, had raised someone good and strong and kind. The morning after her arrest and subsequent release on bail, Amelia sat at her kitchen table with her phone in her hands, trying to decide whether to call Zara. What would she say? How do you tell your daughter that the world thinks you're a monster? Instead, she made coffee. The ritual was soothing, measuring grounds into the filter, pouring water into the reservoir, listening to the machine gurgle and hiss as it worked. She'd bought this coffee maker at a yard sale 7 years ago, and it had become as essential to her mornings as breathing. While the coffee brewed, she watered the plants, checking for yellowing leaves, adjusting those that needed more light, murmuring encouragement to the ones that struggled. Mrs. Okoye had left a note under her door sometime during the night. Amelia found it when she finally gathered the courage to check her mail. The handwriting was shaky, uncertain. I don't know what to believe. I need time to think. Please understand. Amelia understood. She understood too well. She folded the note carefully and placed it in the kitchen drawer where she kept warranties and instruction manuals. Things that might be needed later, evidence of how things were supposed to work. Her phone rang at 8:37 a.m. The nonprofit where she worked as operations coordinator, managing grant applications and volunteer schedules and the thousand small details that kept the organization running. It was her supervisor, Leonard Pritchard, a man who'd always seemed kind if somewhat distant, more comfortable with spreadsheets than people. Amelia, he said, and she could hear the discomfort in his voice, the way he cleared his throat twice before continuing. I'm calling about your employment status. Given the situation, the board feels it would be best if you took a leave of absence. Indefinite. Unpaid. Leonard, I haven't been convicted of anything. I haven't even been formally charged. I understand that. But the optics, Amelia, we work with children. Families trust us. If word gets out that we're employing someone who's under investigation for... He couldn't finish the sentence. Amelia closed her eyes. I understand. Your personal items will be boxed up and sent to your address. I'm sorry. I truly am. The line went dead. Amelia set the phone down carefully, as if it might shatter. The coffee had finished brewing, and the apartment smelled rich and dark, a scent that usually brought comfort but now just reminded her of how many mornings she'd taken for granted, how many ordinary moments she'd assumed would continue forever. She'd been working at the nonprofit for 6 years. Before that, she'd spent time in various administrative roles, a medical office, an insurance company, a law firm where the partners treated their staff like furniture. She'd left teaching after Benjamin Morrison disappeared, unable to face a classroom again, unable to shake the guilt that followed her like a shadow. What if she'd been more attentive? What if she'd noticed something the others missed? What if she could have prevented whatever terrible thing had happened? The official investigation in 2005 had been thorough but ultimately fruitless. Benjamin had vanished between the fire drill and the final bell, a window of perhaps 30 minutes when confusion reigned and accountability fractured. Search parties had combed through the neighborhood. News crews had camped outside the school. Benjamin's parents, Richard and Carolyn Morrison, had appeared on television, their faces etched with a grief so profound it seemed to hollow them out from the inside. Amelia had attended every community meeting, had joined the search efforts, had given statement after statement to police who grew increasingly frustrated with the lack of leads. She'd never been a suspect, not really. Just another witness to an incomprehensible tragedy. Another person who'd failed to protect a child who needed protecting. But she'd carried it anyway. The weight of it. The what-ifs that multiplied in the dark hours before dawn. She'd thrown herself into other work, other ways of helping, as if enough goodness could somehow balance the scales. Now all of that was being stripped away, layer by layer, until she was left with nothing but the raw, exposed truth. She was alone, suspected, already convicted in the court of public opinion before any trial began. Her phone buzzed. A text from her lawyer, Maria Velasquez, a public defender who'd been assigned to her case. Need to meet. Today, if possible. New developments. Amelia's hands shook as she typed a response. What kind of developments? The reply came quickly. Not over text. Can you come to my office at 2 p.m.? The hours until the appointment stretched like taffy. Amelia tried to read, but the words blurred together. She tried to clean, but every surface she touched seemed to whisper accusations. Finally, she went to her bedroom closet and pulled out the box she kept on the top shelf, the one filled with memories from her teaching years. Inside were photographs of students, gap-toothed grins and missing front teeth, art projects and thank you cards drawn in crayon. There were lesson plans she'd been particularly proud of, attendance sheets, a teacher appreciation mug that had cracked down the middle, and there, near the bottom, was a photograph of her third-grade class from Riverside Elementary. 24 students arranged in 3 rows, Amelia kneeling on the end with her hand on Benjamin Morrison's shoulder. He was smiling in the picture, a tentative expression that didn't quite reach his eyes. She remembered how quiet he'd been, how he'd struggled with reading but excelled at math, how he'd light up during science lessons about dinosaurs and space. She remembered his mother picking him up one afternoon, the woman's tired eyes and forced smile, the way she'd held Benjamin's hand just a little too tightly. Amelia traced the outline of Benjamin's face with one finger. "I'm so sorry," she whispered to the photograph. "I'm so sorry I couldn't save you." At 1:45 p.m., she left her apartment for the walk to Maria's office. The day was overcast, the sky pressing down like a lead weight. She kept her head down, avoiding eye contact with neighbors and strangers alike. Someone had spray-painted "Child Killer" on the sidewalk 3 blocks from her building. The red letters screamed up at her, and she quickened her pace, heart hammering. Maria Velasquez's office was in a converted row house near City Hall, the rooms cramped and cluttered with case files stacked in precarious towers. Maria herself was in her early 40s, with gray-streaked hair pulled into a messy bun and reading glasses perpetually perched on top of her head. She gestured Amelia into a chair that had seen better decades. "I'm going to be straight with you," Maria said without preamble. "The prosecution is building a circumstantial case, but it's strong. Too strong. The backpack, the fibers, your connection to the building. It's enough to convince a jury if we can't provide reasonable doubt." "I didn't do this," Amelia said, and she hated how weak her voice sounded, how desperate. "I believe you, but belief doesn't win cases. Evidence does. So we need to find some." Maria pulled out a legal pad covered in notes. "Tell me about your life in 2005. Everything. Where you worked, who you knew, who had access to your apartment, who might have had a reason to frame you." "Frame me? Why would anyone?" "Because that backpack didn't walk itself into that basement," Maria interrupted. "Either you put it there, which you say you didn't, or someone else did. And if someone else did, we need to figure out who and why." Amelia closed her eyes and reached back through 18 years of memory. 2005. Zara had been 12, going through a difficult phase of acting out and skipping school. Amelia had been working multiple jobs, barely keeping their heads above water. The apartment on Watkins Street had been cheap because the building was falling apart, with leaky pipes and unreliable heat and neighbors who fought loud enough to wake the dead. "There was a super," she said slowly. "Thomas something. Thomas Klein. He had keys to all the units. He was creepy, always finding excuses to come by, always staring just a little too long." Maria wrote quickly. "Anyone else?" "Neighbors. A couple on the first floor, the Hendersons. They complained about everything, noise, smells, the way I parked my car. There was a young guy on the 3rd floor, college student maybe. I don't remember his name. And," she paused, thinking, "and there was a woman, Sarah Chin. She was friendly at first, used to watch Zara sometimes when I was stuck at work. But we had a falling out." "About what?" Amelia felt her cheeks flush with old anger and embarrassment. "She asked to borrow money. A lot of money, $5,000. Said it was an emergency, that she'd pay me back within a month. I couldn't do it. I didn't have it. She got angry, said I was selfish, that I didn't care about people who'd helped me. And this was when? Late 2005, maybe October, right around when Benjamin disappeared." Maria's pen stilled. Interesting timing. They talked for another hour, Maria probing for details, connections, anything that might crack open an alternative narrative. By the time Amelia left the office, her head throbbed and her throat was raw from talking. The sky had darkened, threatening rain again, and she hurried toward the bus stop. Her phone rang. Zara's number lit up the screen, and Amelia's heart clenched. She'd been avoiding this call, but there was no more time left. She answered. "Mom." Zara's voice was tight with tears. "Mom, I saw the news. What's happening? Tell me it's not true." "Baby," Amelia said, and the word broke in half. "Baby, I promise you, I didn't hurt anyone. I would never." "Then why are they saying these things? Why is your face on every news channel?" "Mom, people are calling me, texting me, saying horrible things about you. About our family." Amelia stopped walking, leaning against a storefront window for support. Rain began to fall, light at first, then harder. "I don't know, baby. I don't know why this is happening. But I'm going to fight it. I'm going to prove I'm innocent. I want to come home. I'm going to take a leave from school and—" "No." Amelia's voice was firm. "No, you stay right where you are. You keep studying, keep living your life. Don't let this destroy what you've built." "But Mom." "Zara, listen to me. You are the best thing I have ever done. You are proof that I am not the person they're saying I am. So you stay there and you be brilliant and you trust me to handle this. Can you do that?" Silence. Then, small and scared, "I trust you, Mom." After the call ended, Amelia stood in the rain and let herself cry, the water washing away the tears as quickly as they fell. Around her, the city moved on. Cars passing, people hurrying by with umbrellas, the world continuing its rotation as if her life wasn't imploding. She thought about Benjamin Morrison, about the last time she'd seen him alive. He'd been wearing a blue jacket that day, she remembered, and he'd asked her a question during math time, something about whether dinosaurs could count. She'd laughed and told him that was a very smart question, and he'd smiled that tentative smile and returned to his worksheet. That was the last thing she remembered. A boy asking about dinosaurs. A moment of connection so ordinary it should have been forgettable. But now it was everything. The arrest became public knowledge within 48 hours. Amelia woke on the third morning to find reporters camped outside her building, their cameras trained on her windows like predators waiting for movement. She peeked through the blinds and saw at least 6 news vans, their satellite dishes extended toward the gray November sky. Someone had leaked her address, and now her sanctuary had become a fishbowl. Mrs. Okoye's door remained closed. No smell of fresh bread wafted from beneath it. The silence felt accusatory. Amelia's phone had become a weapon turned against her. Text messages poured in from numbers she didn't recognize, most of them vicious. "Baby killer. Hope you rot in hell. They should bring back the death penalty for monsters like you." She stopped reading them after the first dozen. But she couldn't stop hearing the phone buzz, couldn't stop seeing the notifications pile up like evidence of her new reality. Maria had advised her not to leave the apartment unless absolutely necessary. "The media will crucify you," she'd warned. "Every facial expression, every word you say will be twisted. Stay hidden until we're ready to control the narrative." But staying hidden meant suffocating. By the 4th day, Amelia felt like the walls were closing in. The apartment that had once felt cozy now transformed into a cell. She needed groceries. Her refrigerator contained nothing but wilting lettuce and a half-empty container of yogurt past its expiration date. She needed to feel human again, even if humanity no longer seemed to want her. She waited until after midnight, then slipped out through the building's back entrance that led to the alley. The air was cold and sharp, carrying the scent of approaching winter. She walked quickly, hood pulled up, hands jammed in her pockets. The 24-hour grocery store was 6 blocks away, its fluorescent lights harsh and unwelcoming. Inside, she moved through the aisles like a ghost, selecting items without really seeing them. Bread, eggs, milk, coffee. The basics. At the checkout, the young cashier, a girl maybe 19 with purple streaks in her hair, looked up from her phone and froze. Recognition dawned in her eyes, followed by something that looked like fear. "You're her," the girl whispered. "You're the woman from the news. The one who—" "I didn't do anything," Amelia said quietly. "I'm innocent." The girl's hand hovered over the register, trembling. I need to call my manager. Please. I just want to buy my groceries and go home. But the girl was already backing away, already pulling out her phone. Amelia abandoned her basket and ran, the automatic doors sliding open just fast enough to let her escape. Behind her, she heard shouting, heard footsteps. She didn't look back. The next morning, a video of the grocery store incident had gone viral. Someone's security camera had captured the whole thing, and the internet had decided she looked guilty. Watch the child killer run when confronted, the headlines screamed. Amelia Taylor can't face her accusers. Maria called, her voice tight with frustration. I told you to stay inside. I needed food, Amelia said numbly. You needed to listen to your lawyer. This is a PR disaster. The prosecution is going to use this footage to paint you as someone who runs from responsibility, someone who can't face the truth. What truth? I didn't do anything. I know that, but the world doesn't. And every time you appear in public looking scared and guilty, you make my job harder. Amelia hung up and threw the phone across the room. It hit the wall and clattered to the floor, the screen cracking in a spiderweb pattern. She stared at the damage and felt nothing. What was one more broken thing in a life that had shattered completely? The formal charges came on day 7. Kidnapping and murder. The words appeared on official documents, stamped and signed, transforming speculation into accusation. The prosecution claimed that Amelia had lured Benjamin Morrison to her apartment, had kept him there for reasons they were still investigating, and that something had gone wrong. They painted a picture of a struggling single mother who'd snapped under pressure, who'd made a terrible choice in a moment of desperation. None of it was true. All of it sounded plausible. The preliminary hearing was set for 3 weeks out. Maria worked frantically to build a defense, tracking down old neighbors and colleagues, searching for anyone who might remember something, anything that could provide an alternative explanation. But 18 years was a long time. Memories faded. People moved on. And those who did remember often didn't want to get involved. Thomas Klein, the building superintendent, had died in 2012. Heart attack, according to public records. Maria tried to find others who'd worked in the building, but the property had changed hands multiple times, and records were incomplete. Sarah Chun, the neighbor Amelia had fallen out with, proved more promising. Maria located her in Jersey, working as a dental hygienist and married with 3 children. When Maria called to arrange an interview, Sarah's response was immediate and hostile. I don't have anything to say about Amelia Taylor, she told Maria. That woman is poison. She ruined my life once, and I won't let her do it again. She ruined your life? Maria had pressed. How? But Sarah had hung up, and subsequent calls went unanswered. Amelia learned all of this in bits and pieces, during meetings in Maria's cluttered office where hope went to die. Each dead end felt like another nail in the coffin of her defense. Each missing witness was another voice that couldn't speak on her behalf. Meanwhile, the court of public opinion had already reached its verdict. Someone started a Facebook group called Justice for Benjamin Morrison, and within days it had 50,000 members. They posted pictures of Benjamin as a child, smiling and innocent, alongside photos of Amelia looking stern and unfriendly. Images carefully selected to create a narrative of predator and prey. A petition circulated demanding the death penalty if she was convicted. It gathered 200,000 signatures in a week. Benjamin's mother, Carolyn Morrison, gave an interview to a national news program. She sat in a carefully lit living room, tissues in hand, and spoke about the son she'd lost 18 years ago. He was my whole world, she said, her voice breaking. And someone took him from me. Someone destroyed our family. If Amelia Taylor is responsible, then I want her to face the full weight of justice. No parent should have to endure what we've endured. Amelia watched the interview alone in her darkened apartment, and she wept for Carolyn Morrison, for the pain that had never healed, for the loss that had defined 18 years of her life. She wanted to reach through the screen and tell her, I didn't do this. I understand your pain because I'm a mother too. I would never, ever harm your son. But there was no reaching through, no way to make herself heard above the roar of accusation and assumption. Zara called every day now, sometimes multiple times. She'd stopped going to classes, was falling behind in her research. "I can't concentrate," she admitted during one call. "I keep thinking about you, about what you're going through." "Mom, I should be there." "And do what?" Amelia asked, hating the bitterness in her own voice. "Watch me fall apart? Let my guilt by association destroy your future too. You're not guilty. You didn't do anything. Try telling that to the thousands of people who want me dead." The preliminary hearing arrived like an execution date. Amelia dressed in the most conservative outfit she owned, a navy suit she'd bought for job interviews, paired with modest heels and simple jewelry. Maria had coached her on courtroom demeanor. Sit up straight, make eye contact but don't stare, show emotion but not too much, be human but not too human. "Juries are looking for remorse," Maria had explained. "But if you show remorse, it looks like admission of guilt. So you need to project dignified sadness. You're sorry Benjamin died, but you didn't kill him. Thread that needle." The courthouse was a granite fortress downtown, its steps crowded with protesters holding signs. "Justice for Benjamin. Lock her up. Child murderers deserve death." Amelia kept her eyes down as police officers escorted her through the crowd, their bodies forming a barrier against the screaming faces and raised fists. Inside, the courtroom smelled of old wood and older secrets. The gallery was packed with spectators, reporters, and Benjamin's family. Carolyn Morrison sat in the front row, flanked by her husband Richard and several people Amelia assumed were relatives or supporters. Carolyn's eyes followed Amelia across the room, burning with an intensity that made Amelia's skin crawl. The prosecution's case was presented by Assistant District Attorney James Hartwell, a man in his 50s with silver hair and the smooth confidence of someone who'd never lost a high-profile case. He laid out the evidence methodically. The backpack discovered in Amelia's former building, the DNA match, the fiber evidence, the timeline that placed her at the school when Benjamin disappeared. "The facts are clear," Hartwell told the judge. Amelia Taylor had opportunity, means, and a documented history of struggling financially and emotionally during the period in question. While we may never know the exact circumstances that led to Benjamin Morrison's death, the physical evidence leaves no doubt that Miss Taylor was involved. Maria stood for the defense, and Amelia watched her lawyer transform from tired public defender to fierce advocate. "Your Honor, the prosecution's case is built entirely on circumstantial evidence that can be explained by innocent means. Miss Taylor was a substitute teacher in Benjamin's classroom, so of course her fibers might have ended up on his belongings. She lived in the building where the backpack was found, but so did dozens of other people, any of whom could have planted the evidence. And let's not forget that 18 years passed between Benjamin's disappearance and this supposed discovery. 18 years during which this backpack could have been moved, contaminated, or deliberately placed to frame my client." The judge, an older woman named Henrietta Walsh with reading glasses that made her eyes look enormous, listened impassively. When both sides had finished their arguments, she took less than 10 minutes to reach her decision. "Based on the evidence presented, there is sufficient cause to proceed to trial. The defendant will remain free on bail under the existing conditions. Trial date will be set within 60 days. The gavel fell, and with it, Amelia's last hope of a quick resolution. She was going to trial. She was going to have to sit in a courtroom and listen to strangers debate whether she was a murderer, listen to Benjamin's family testify about their grief, listen to expert witnesses explain how the evidence proved her guilt. Outside the courthouse, Maria tried to sound optimistic. "This was expected. We knew they'd move forward. But now we have time to build our case, to find the witnesses we need." "What witnesses?" Amelia asked. "Everyone from that time is gone or doesn't want to talk. We have nothing. We have your innocence. That counts for something." "Does it?" Amelia looked back at the courthouse, where protesters still chanted and cameras still rolled. "Because from where I'm standing, it doesn't count for anything at all." That night, someone threw a brick through Amelia's apartment window. It came through around 2 a.m., shattering glass across her living room floor and sending her plants tumbling from their perches. The jade plant, Hope, landed upside down, its pot broken, soil spilling across the hardwood. Amelia called the police, but they took 45 minutes to arrive, and when they did, their sympathy was tepid at best. "Probably neighborhood kids," one officer said, not quite meeting her eyes. "We'll file a report." After they left, Amelia sat amid the broken glass and tried to save her jade plant. She repotted it carefully, whispering apologies for the trauma, promising it would be okay. But two of the main stems had snapped, and no amount of care would bring them back. She stayed up the rest of the night, boarding up the window with cardboard and duct tape, then cleaning the glass, then sitting in the darkness and wondering how much more she could endure before she broke as completely as the plants and windows and phones. The answer, she suspected, was not much more at all. The media attention intensified after the preliminary hearing. True crime podcasters dissected every aspect of Amelia's life, analyzing her social media history, interviewing former colleagues who barely remembered her, constructing theories about motive and method. One podcast spent an entire episode examining photographs of her apartment, claiming the number of plants indicated hoarding tendencies and an obsessive need for control. Another podcast tracked down Zara and ambushed her outside her apartment in Boston. Amelia only learned about it when Zara called, sobbing so hard she could barely speak. "They asked me if I thought you did it," Zara choked out. "They put a camera in my face and asked me if I was scared of you when I was a child. Mom, I didn't know what to say." "What did you say?" Amelia asked, her heart in her throat. "I told them to fuck off and go to hell, and then I ran. But Mom, they filmed it. They're going to use it, aren't they? They're going to make me look like I'm hiding something. Listen to me, baby. None of this is your fault. None of it. You don't owe those people anything. Not explanations, not interviews, not even basic civility." "I hate them," Zara whispered. "I hate everyone who's doing this to you, to us." Amelia felt the words like a brand against her skin. Hate was a strong word, but it fit. She was beginning to hate too. Hate the faceless masses who'd convicted her without evidence. Hate the system that had failed to protect her. Hate the randomness of fate that had put her in that classroom on that day 18 years ago. Most of all, she hated that she couldn't prove her innocence. Couldn't point to the real culprit and say, "There, that's who you should blame." Because the truth was, she didn't know what had happened to Benjamin Morrison. She'd lived with that not knowing for 18 years, carried it like a stone in her chest. And now that stone was crushing her. Maria continued investigating, but leads dried up faster than puddles in summer sun. The college student who'd lived on the third floor of the Watkins Street building was deceased, drug overdose in 2009. The Hendersons, the complaining couple on the first floor, had divorced and scattered to opposite coasts. Neither wanted to talk about the past. The only promising lead was Sarah Chun, and she remained stubbornly unavailable. Maria hired a private investigator to look into Sarah's life, searching for anything that might explain her hostility toward Amelia. What they found was interesting but inconclusive. Sarah had declared bankruptcy in 2006, just months after Benjamin's disappearance. She'd lost her apartment, her car, everything. The financial collapse was total and swift. Could be coincidence, Maria mused during one of their meetings, or it could be relevant. If she was desperate for money in 2005, desperate enough to ask you for $5,000, you think she kidnapped Benjamin for ransom? Amelia asked, unable to quite believe it. I think we need to explore every possibility. And right now, she's the only person from your building who's still alive and acting suspicious. But proving suspicion was different from proving guilt. And without Sarah's cooperation, they had nothing but speculation and desperation. The trial date was set, February 14th, Valentine's Day. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Love and judgment twisted together like DNA strands. Amelia marked the date on her calendar and felt time begin its countdown toward her potential destruction. The break came from an unexpected source. A retired postal worker named Gerald Timmons who'd been following the case on the news. He walked into Maria's office on a cold January afternoon, his hands shaking as he held out a manila envelope yellowed with age. I don't know if this matters, he said, his voice thin and reedy. But I've been carrying this guilt for 18 years, and I can't do it anymore. Inside the envelope were photocopies of mail forwarding requests from 2005. Gerald had worked the route that included Watkins Street, and he'd kept personal records of unusual forwarding requests, a habit born from decades of noticing patterns others missed. One request stood out. Sarah Chun had filed to forward her mail to a P.O. box in Delaware starting November 1, 2005, just 2 weeks after Benjamin Morrison disappeared. But according to public records, she hadn't officially moved out of her apartment until January 2006. She was getting mail sent somewhere else while still living at Watkins Street, Maria said, studying the documents with growing excitement. Why would she do that unless she was planning something? Gerald leaned forward, his watery eyes intense. There's more. I remember her because she was always anxious when I delivered packages. Always watching from her window, always rushing down to grab things before anyone else could see. And around that time, late October 2005, she got a lot of packages. Heavy ones. I remember because my back was killing me that month. What kind of packages? No return addresses. Just plain brown boxes. Must have been 6 or 7 of them over a 2-week period. Maria immediately called her private investigator. I need everything you can find on Sarah Chen's movements in October and November 2005. Bank records, credit card statements, phone records if you can get them. And find out what's in Delaware that she might have been connected to. The investigator worked fast. Within a week, they had enough pieces to start assembling a very different picture of that autumn. Sarah Chun had opened a storage unit in Wilmington, Delaware on October 15, 2005, 3 days before Benjamin Morrison disappeared. She'd paid for 6 months up front in cash. The storage facility's records showed she'd accessed the unit multiple times in late October and early November, then never again. Credit card records revealed purchases at a hardware store in Philadelphia. Rope, plastic sheeting, heavy-duty cleaning supplies, all bought on October 17th. And buried in old bank statements was a deposit of $12,000 in mid-November 2005, just weeks after Sarah had claimed to be so desperate for money that she'd begged Amelia for a loan. Where did $12,000 come from? Maria asked the private investigator. Can't trace it. It was a cash deposit. But the timing is damning. Maria filed a motion to compel Sarah Chun to testify, armed with the new evidence. The prosecution fought back, but Judge Walsh ruled in the defense's favor. Sarah Chun would have to take the stand. The day Sarah arrived at court, Amelia barely recognized her. The woman she'd known in 2005 had been young and pretty, with an easy smile and confident demeanor. The woman who walked into the courtroom looked worn down by life, her face lined with bitterness, her eyes hard. Sarah's testimony began with softball questions from Maria, establishing her connection to Amelia and the Watkins Street building. But when Maria brought out the forwarding records, the storage unit receipts, the bank statements, Sarah's composure cracked. I don't have to explain my financial decisions to you, Sarah snapped. Actually, you do, Maria replied calmly. You're under oath. So let me ask again. Why did you open a storage unit in Delaware 3 days before Benjamin Morrison disappeared? That's none of your business. And where did $12,000 in cash come from in November 2005? I don't remember. You don't remember receiving $12,000 in cash? Sarah's jaw tightened. It was 18 years ago. People forget things. Judge Walsh leaned forward. Ms. Chun, you need to answer the question or I'll hold you in contempt. For a long moment, Sarah said nothing. The courtroom was silent except for the soft hum of the ventilation system. Amelia watched emotions play across Sarah's face. Fear, anger, calculation. And then something broke. Fine, Sarah said, her voice hollow. You want the truth? The truth is that I was desperate. My boyfriend at the time, he had gambling debts. Bad debts. The kind that get you hurt if you don't pay. He needed $20,000 by the end of October, or they were going to kill him. Maybe kill me too. So we made a plan. The courtroom erupted. Judge Walsh banged her gavel, demanding order. In the gallery, Carolyn Morrison stood up, her face white with shock. Maria let the chaos settle before asking the next question, her voice steady despite the bombshell. What plan, Miss Chun? Sarah's eyes found Amelia's across the courtroom, and in them, Amelia saw something that looked almost like apology. Almost. We were going to kidnap a child, hold them for ransom. We picked Benjamin Morrison because his parents had money. His dad was a doctor, his mom worked in finance. We thought they could pay. We thought. She swallowed hard. We thought it would be quick. Get the money. Return the kid. Disappear before anyone figured out who we were. The words hung in the air like poison gas. Maria pressed forward. What happened? Everything went wrong. My boyfriend, Derek, he was supposed to grab the kid during the confusion of the fire drill. We'd planned it, pulled the alarm, created chaos. Derek got Benjamin into his car, took him to the storage unit in Delaware. But then, Sarah's voice broke. Then Derek panicked. He gave Benjamin too much of the sedative. By the time I got there that night, the kid was already dead. Carolyn Morrison's scream cut through the courtroom like a blade. Richard Morrison caught his wife as she collapsed, and bailiffs rushed to help. Judge Walsh called for a recess, but Maria wasn't finished. And Amelia Taylor? What was her role in this? Sarah looked up, tears streaming down her face. She didn't have any role. She had nothing to do with it. Derek and we needed a scapegoat, someone to blame if things went wrong. Amelia had refused to lend me money, so I was angry at her. And she was Benjamin's teacher that day. It was easy to plant evidence in her apartment. Derek still had keys from when he'd worked maintenance at the building years before. We put the backpack in her storage locker in the basement. Figured if police ever searched the building, they'd find it and assume she was guilty. And the fibers from her clothing? We broke into her apartment while she was at work, took some items, rubbed them on the inside of the backpack, returned them to her closet. It wasn't hard. She never knew we were there. Amelia felt the world tilt and right itself again. 18 years of secret guilt, of wondering what she'd missed, what she could have done differently, and she'd never had any chance to save him. Benjamin Morrison had been dead before she'd even finished counting her students, before the search had begun, before hope had transformed into horror. The relief was overwhelming, and so was the grief for Benjamin, for his family, for all the years stolen by a lie. The trial was immediately suspended. The prosecution dropped all charges against Amelia and instead filed charges against Sarah Chun for kidnapping, murder, evidence tampering, and obstruction of justice. A warrant was issued for Derek Pullman, Sarah's former boyfriend, who'd disappeared years ago but was now the subject of a nationwide manhunt. Maria held a press conference on the courthouse steps. Cameras flashed as she read a prepared statement. Today, justice has begun to correct a terrible wrong. Amelia Taylor is an innocent woman who was victimized twice, first by the criminals who committed this heinous act, and second by a system that was too quick to accept easy answers instead of searching for the truth. We are grateful that Ms. Chen's conscience finally compelled her to come forward, though we grieve that it took 18 years for the truth to emerge. Amelia stood beside Maria, blinking in the sudden sunlight after so many weeks of darkness. Reporters shouted questions, but she couldn't hear them over the roaring in her ears. Someone in the crowd held a sign that said, "We're sorry, Amelia," and she started to cry. Zara was there, having driven down from Boston the moment she'd heard. She pushed through the crowd and wrapped her arms around her mother, and they stood together on the courthouse steps, holding each other as the world they'd known reassembled itself into something new and fragile. Later, in a quiet room away from cameras and questions, the Morrisons asked to meet with Amelia. She didn't want to go, didn't know what she could possibly say to parents who'd lost their son. But Maria encouraged her, and Zara squeezed her hand, and somehow she found the courage. Carolyn Morrison looked smaller in person, as if grief had physically diminished her. Richard stood beside her, his hand on her shoulder, both of them looking at Amelia with expressions that mixed relief with unbearable sadness. "We owe you an apology," Carolyn said, her voice rough from crying. I believed you hurt our son. I wanted you to pay for his death. I'm so sorry." Amelia shook her head, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "You don't owe me anything. You lost your child. Your anger made sense. It was justified. But it was directed at the wrong person. It was directed at the only person you could reach. I understand that. They talked for an hour, sharing memories of Benjamin, his love of dinosaurs, his quiet nature, the way he'd struggled in school but never gave up trying. Carolyn told stories Amelia had never heard, about Benjamin's artwork and his obsession with collecting rocks and his dreams of becoming a paleontologist when he grew up. He talked about you, Carolyn said at one point, after those 3 weeks you taught his class. He said you were nice, that you never got angry when he asked too many questions. The words broke something in Amelia, released a grief she'd been holding for 18 years. She wept for Benjamin Morrison, for the life he should have had, for the man he would have become. And the Morrisons wept with her, 3 people bound by tragedy and now, perhaps, by the beginning of healing. When Amelia finally left the courthouse, the sun was setting, painting the Philadelphia sky in shades of orange and purple. The protesters were gone. Most of the reporters had left. The street looked almost normal, as if the earth-shaking revelations of the day were already fading into history. Mrs. Okoye was waiting outside Amelia's building, holding a loaf of fresh bread wrapped in a kitchen towel. When she saw Amelia, she started crying, and they embraced in the hallway, 2 women who'd nearly let suspicion destroy their friendship. "I should have trusted you," Mrs. Okoye said. "I should have known better." "You couldn't have known. No one could. But I should have believed in you anyway. That's what neighbors do. What friends do." That night, Amelia slept for 12 hours straight, the first real sleep she'd had in weeks. When she woke, her phone was full of messages. Apologies from colleagues, from former students, from strangers who'd condemned her and now felt ashamed. She deleted most of them without reading, keeping only the ones from people who mattered. Zara, Maria, Mrs. Okoye, a few friends who'd stood by her even when the world turned away. The jade plant on her windowsill was putting out new growth, tiny leaves unfurling toward the light. Hope, resilient and stubborn, refusing to die. The weeks following Sarah Chen's confession moved in strange rhythms. Part rushed chaos, part suspended animation. Derek Pullman was apprehended in Arizona, working under an assumed name at a car dealership. His arrest made headlines, though smaller ones than Amelia's had. The public's appetite for outrage, it seemed, had limits. Amelia's life didn't return to normal because there was no normal to return to. The nonprofit called Apologetic and Awkward, offering her old position back with back pay and a promise to make things right. She declined. Some bridges, once burned, aren't worth rebuilding. Instead, she did something unexpected. She went back to school. At 48 years old, she enrolled in a master's program for counseling, focusing on wrongful conviction and criminal justice reform. If her nightmare had taught her anything, it was that the system failed people regularly, and those people needed advocates who understood what it meant to fall through the cracks. Zara returned to Boston and her studies, but she called every night without fail. Their relationship had deepened through crisis, transformed from parent and child into something more equal, more mutually supportive. They made plans for Zara to come home for spring break, to spend time together without the weight of accusation hanging over them. The city of Philadelphia offered a settlement compensation for wrongful arrest, legal fees, emotional distress. The amount was substantial enough to provide stability, modest enough to feel like an insult. Amelia accepted it anyway. Money wouldn't heal what had been broken, but it would allow her to rebuild without the constant terror of poverty. Maria Velasquez became more than just her lawyer. They met for coffee regularly, comparing notes on cases, on the 1,000 ways the justice system chewed up innocent people and spit them out. Maria was working on several other cases of potential wrongful conviction, and Amelia found herself drawn into the work, reviewing evidence, interviewing witnesses, using her own experience to identify the patterns of planted evidence and coerced confessions. 3 months after the charges were dropped, the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office announced the formation of a conviction integrity unit, tasked with reviewing questionable cases and identifying potential wrongful convictions. Amelia was invited to serve on an advisory board, lending the perspective of someone who'd survived the system's failures. At the first meeting, She sat across from prosecutors and defense attorneys, judges and activists, all theoretically united in the goal of justice. The conversation was frank and sometimes heated. Mistakes were acknowledged. Reforms were proposed. Amelia spoke about the rush to judgment, about how circumstantial evidence had been woven into a narrative of guilt without anyone stopping to ask whether other explanations existed. "I was lucky," she told the group. "I was innocent, and eventually the truth came out. But how many people in prison right now are innocent too, without the benefit of a guilty party's confession? How many lives are we destroying because it's easier to close a case than to pursue the truth?" Her words resonated. Local news covered the meeting, and suddenly Amelia found herself in demand as a speaker. Universities invited her to address criminal justice classes. Community groups asked her to share her story. She said yes more often than not, despite the discomfort of reliving those dark weeks, because if her suffering could prevent someone else's, then it had to mean something. The Morrisons remained in her life in ways both expected and surprising. Carolyn and Richard started a foundation in Benjamin's name, dedicated to improving child safety and supporting families of missing children. Amelia joined the board, contributing her time and her newly relevant experience with media attention and public advocacy. During one foundation meeting, Carolyn pulled Amelia aside. "I've been in therapy," she said quietly, "processing everything. And my therapist asked me something interesting. She asked if I'd forgiven Sarah Chun." "Have you?" Amelia asked. "I don't know. I'm still angry, still devastated by what she took from us. But I'm also trying to understand how desperation can make people do terrible things. She was facing death threats from loan sharks. She and Derek made catastrophic choices, but they didn't set out to kill my son. That doesn't excuse anything, but it complicates things." Amelia nodded. She'd been wrestling with similar questions about forgiveness and understanding. Sarah Chun had destroyed her life for months, had planted evidence that could have sent her to prison for decades. And yet, Sarah's confession had also been an act of courage. She'd had to have known the consequences, and she'd told the truth anyway. "I saw her," Amelia admitted, "last week, at the prison." Carolyn's eyes widened. "You visited Sarah?" "I needed to understand. Needed to hear directly from her why she chose me as the scapegoat." "What did she say?" "That I was convenient. That she'd been angry I wouldn't lend her money. So when they needed someone to blame, I was right there. It wasn't personal in the way I thought it was. I was just available." They sat in silence for a moment, two women bound by the capricious cruelty of circumstance. Finally, Carolyn said, "I don't know if I can visit her. I don't know if I want to understand." "You don't have to. Everyone processes this differently. There's no right way to survive what you've survived." 6 months after the truth emerged, Amelia was offered a teaching position at a small private school in the suburbs. The headmaster was a progressive educator who believed in second chances and truth-telling. "We've followed your story," he said during the interview. "What happened to you was unconscionable. But the way you've handled it, the way you've turned your pain into advocacy, that's the kind of integrity we want our students to see." She accepted, though the first day back in a classroom was harder than she'd anticipated. The students were middle schoolers, old enough to have heard about her case, young enough to be uncertain about how to react. She addressed it head-on during her introduction. "Some of you may know that I was accused of a terrible crime," she told them. "I was innocent, and eventually the truth came out. But I learned something important during that time. Truth doesn't always win quickly. Sometimes it takes years. Sometimes it requires courage from unexpected people. And sometimes the system we trust to protect us fails spectacularly." She paused, looking at their young faces, some skeptical, some sympathetic, all attentive. "So in this class, we're going to talk about evidence and burden of proof. We're going to discuss the difference between accusation and guilt. And we're going to remember that every person accused of something, whether it's a crime or just a rumor, deserves the chance to tell their side of the story." The class became one of her most popular. Students engaged with criminal justice issues, debated cases, learned to think critically about evidence and media narratives. Several wrote college application essays about what they'd learned, about how Amelia's experience had changed their understanding of justice. A year passed, then another. The jade plant on Amelia's windowsill grew strong and healthy, its leaves deep green and glossy. She'd repotted it twice, giving it more room to spread, and it had rewarded her patience with steady, quiet growth. Sometimes she still called it hope, though increasingly it felt less like hope and more like proof. Proof that things could survive trauma, could grow new stems when old ones broke, could thrive even after being upended and replanted. Zara graduated with her master's degree in environmental science and moved back to Philadelphia, taking a position with a nonprofit focused on urban green spaces. They found an apartment together, a 2-bedroom with good light and room for even more plants. Living together as adults was different from their earlier years. More negotiation, more respect for boundaries, but also more laughter, more honest conversation, more appreciation for having survived the crucible together. Detective Marcus Chen, who'd arrested Amelia that November evening, reached out through Maria to request a meeting. Amelia agreed, curious about what he wanted to say. They met at a cafe, and Marcus looked older than she remembered, the lines around his eyes deeper. "I owe you an apology," he started without preamble. "I made assumptions based on circumstantial evidence. I built a case around a narrative instead of following the facts wherever they led. And I almost destroyed your life because of it." "You were doing your job," Amelia said, though the words felt hollow. "My job is to find the truth, not to close cases quickly. I failed at that. I failed Benjamin Morrison, and I failed you." He pulled out a business card and slid it across the table. "I've been working with the Conviction Integrity Unit reviewing old cases. I'm trying to do better. If you ever want to consult on investigations, share your perspective, I'd welcome it." Amelia took the card, surprised by the gesture. "Why would you want my help?" "Because you know what it's like to be on the other side. You know how easy it is for investigators to see what they expect to see instead of what's actually there. That's valuable. That could save lives." She thought about it for a long moment, then nodded. "I'll consider it." They talked for another hour, comparing notes on the case, on what had gone wrong and how it could have been prevented. It wasn't quite forgiveness, but it was understanding, recognition that good people could make terrible mistakes, and that acknowledging those mistakes was the first step toward preventing future ones. The Benjamin Morrison Foundation grew, expanding its mission to include support for wrongfully accused individuals and their families. Amelia helped design a program that provided immediate resources, legal aid, mental health counseling, financial assistance, for people arrested based on questionable evidence. They called it the Second Chance Initiative, and within its first year, it had helped 43 families navigate the nightmare of wrongful accusation. On the 3rd anniversary of her arrest, Amelia stood in front of the Pennsylvania State Capitol, testifying before a legislative committee about criminal justice reform. She spoke about the need for better evidence collection, for conviction integrity units in every jurisdiction, for compensation programs that didn't require people to prove their innocence beyond all doubt before receiving assistance. "The system treats wrongful conviction as an unfortunate anomaly," she told the committee. "But it's not. It's a predictable outcome of a system that values conviction rates over truth, that relies on circumstantial evidence without adequate scrutiny, that allows tunnel vision to replace thorough investigation. We can do better. We must do better." The reforms she advocated for weren't passed immediately. Change in government moved slowly, grinding through bureaucracy and political considerations. But seeds were planted, conversations started, perspectives shifted. Small victories accumulated. A new law requiring recording of all interrogations, increased funding for public defenders, mandatory training on implicit bias and false evidence. Not enough. Never enough. But something. Mrs. Okoye, now in her 70s and slowing down, taught Amelia how to bake bread. They spent Sunday afternoons in Amelia's kitchen, hands deep in dough, talking about everything and nothing. The bread, dense, aromatic, imperfect, became a meditation, a way of reclaiming time that had been stolen. "You know what I learned?" Mrs. Okoye said one Sunday, punching down dough with surprising force. "I learned that trust is not the same as blind faith. I should have asked you questions, listened to your side, instead of letting fear make my decisions. I'm sorry it took me so long to remember that. You came back, Amelia said simply. That's what matters. The bread baked, filling the apartment with warmth and the smell of home. When it came out of the oven, golden and perfect, they sliced it while it was still too hot, slathering butter that melted into pools. Tasted like redemption. 5 years later, the morning of Amelia's 53rd birthday began with snow, light flakes drifting past her office window at Temple University, where she now worked as an adjunct professor in the criminal justice program. Her course, Wrongful Convictions, Evidence, Advocacy, and Reform, was consistently over-enrolled, with waiting lists that stretched through the semester. Students came to her class for the content, but they stayed for the perspective, the unflinching honesty of someone who'd lived through the system's failures and emerged determined to fix them. On her desk sat the jade plant, now too large for its original pot, its stems thick and woody with age. Hope had become something more than a metaphor. It was a living reminder that growth happened slowly, that survival was its own kind of victory. Next to it was a photograph from last month. Amelia, Zara, and Mrs. Okoye at Zara's wedding, all three women laughing at something beyond the camera's frame. Her phone buzzed with a text from Maria. Coffee after your 2 p.m. class? Have something to discuss. Amelia smiled and typed back her agreement, then turned her attention to the stack of essays waiting for her review. Her students had been asked to analyze a case of potential wrongful conviction, identifying the evidence that supported innocence and the systemic failures that had led to arrest. The papers were thoughtful, passionate, occasionally brilliant. Reading them reminded her why she'd chosen this path. Every student who learned to question, to dig deeper, to resist easy narratives was a small victory against injustice. The 2 p.m. class went well. They were discussing the exoneration of a man who'd spent 30 years in prison for a murder he didn't commit, DNA evidence finally setting him free. A student named Marcus, no relation to Detective Chun, though the coincidence still made Amelia smile, raised his hand. Professor Taylor, do you think he can ever really recover from that? 30 years stolen. How do you come back from that? Amelia considered the question carefully. You don't come back. That's the truth people don't want to hear. You don't return to who you were before the trauma. But you can build a new life, create new meaning. You can choose to let the experience destroy you, or you can choose to let it transform you into someone who fights for others. Neither choice is wrong. Both are valid ways of surviving. After class, she met Maria at their usual cafe, a small place with mismatched furniture and excellent coffee. Maria looked tired but energized, the way she always did when working on something important. I've been approached by a documentary filmmaker, Maria said without preamble. She wants to do a deep dive into your case. What happened, how the truth emerged, what's changed since. She wants to interview you, the Morrisons, Sarah Chun, if possible. She wants to use your story to explore systemic reform. Amelia's first instinct was to say no. She'd told her story so many times it felt worn smooth, the sharp edges of pain dulled by repetition. But then she thought about the people who might watch, the individuals currently trapped in similar nightmares, the families searching for hope. I'll do it, she said. On one condition, it has to be honest. Not just about what happened to me, but about the people who failed along the way. The prosecutors who pushed for conviction without sufficient evidence. The media that convicted me before trial. The public that was so quick to believe the worst. If we're going to do this, we tell the whole truth. Maria grinned. I told her you'd say something like that. The documentary took 9 months to produce. Amelia gave hours of interviews, revisiting memories she'd tried to put behind her. The Morrisons participated as well, speaking frankly about their initial belief in Amelia's guilt and their journey toward understanding. Carolyn had written a book about Benjamin, about losing him and learning to live with loss, and it had become a bestseller, touching thousands of readers who'd experienced similar grief. Sarah Chun, now serving 15 years for kidnapping and manslaughter. Derek Pullman had been sentenced to 30, agreed to be interviewed from prison. Watching the footage later, Amelia was struck by how much Sarah had aged, how grief and guilt had carved canyons into her face. Sarah spoke about desperation and terrible choices, about living with the consequences of one catastrophic decision. "I destroyed so many lives," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Benjamin's, his family's, Amelia's, my own. And for what? For money we never even got. Derek and I, we panicked after Benjamin died. We abandoned the ransom plan, got rid of the body, tried to cover our tracks. We lived with that secret for 18 years, and it poisoned everything. Every relationship, every moment of happiness. It was all contaminated by what we'd done." The documentary, titled Presumed Guilty, The Amelia Taylor Case, premiered at a film festival and was picked up by a major streaming platform. Within weeks, it had been watched by millions. The response was overwhelming: messages of support, apologies from people who'd condemned her, anger at the system that had failed. But more importantly, it sparked action. Lawmakers in 3 states introduced bills based on reforms Amelia had advocated for. District attorneys' offices across the country announced new protocols for evidence review. The Benjamin Morrison Foundation received record donations, allowing them to expand their programs. 8 years later, Zara's daughter, Elena, turned 3 years old on a sunny September afternoon. The birthday party was held in Amelia's backyard. She'd bought a small house in the suburbs 2 years ago, traded the apartment for space and a garden where she could grow not just houseplants but vegetables and flowers, herbs and fruit trees. The jade plant had a permanent home on the patio now, its pot surrounded by smaller plants Amelia had propagated from its cuttings. Hope multiplied, spreading outward in concentric circles. Elena ran through the yard with other children, her laughter piercing and perfect. She had Zara's eyes and fierce independence, and she'd already announced her intention to become either an astronaut or a dinosaur when she grew up. Watching her, Amelia felt the weight of years shift and settle into something that resembled peace. Mrs. Okoye had passed away the previous winter, peacefully in her sleep, and her absence was a constant ache. But she'd lived to see Zara's wedding, to hold Elena as a baby, to know that the friendship she and Amelia had repaired had become unbreakable. At the funeral, Amelia had spoken about bread and trust, about how Mrs. Okoye had taught her that mistakes could be forgiven and bonds could be rebuilt stronger than before. Carolyn and Richard Morrison arrived at the party bearing gifts, and Elena shrieked with delight when she saw the dinosaur toy Richard pulled from a bag. The Morrisons had become extended family, connected by tragedy but sustained by something gentler. Mutual respect, shared purpose, the recognition that healing happened in community. "She would have loved this," Carolyn said quietly, watching Elena play. She didn't have to specify who she meant. Benjamin Morrison would have been 25 now, perhaps married himself, perhaps thinking about children. The absence of his potential life was a shadow that never fully lifted, but it no longer consumed every moment. "She?" Amelia asked gently. "Benjamin?" "No, my mother. She died 6 months after Benjamin disappeared. The grief killed her as surely as any disease. But before she died, she told me something I've never forgotten. She said that love doesn't end when someone dies. Transforms. It becomes something we carry instead of something we share. And she said that the only way to honor the dead is to keep living, to keep loving, to refuse to let grief turn us into ghosts." Amelia squeezed Carolyn's hand, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. 12 years later, the Conviction Integrity Project, which Amelia had helped found and now directed, celebrated its 10th anniversary with a gala at a downtown hotel. Over the past decade, they'd helped exonerate 43 individuals, provided support services to hundreds of families, and trained thousands of law enforcement officers in evidence collection and bias recognition. Amelia stood at the podium in a navy dress, her hair now shot through with silver, and looked out at the crowd of supporters, donors, exonerees, and allies. "We started this project with a simple question," she said. "How do we prevent what happened to me from happening to others?" And the answer, we discovered, was both simple and infinitely complex. We listen. We question. We resist the seductive appeal of easy answers. We remember that behind every case file, every arrest record, every conviction, there's a human being whose life hangs in the balance. She spoke about recent victories: a woman released after serving 8 years for a crime her husband had committed, A young man freed after DNA evidence excluded him from a rape conviction. A teenager whose confession had been coerced finally getting a new trial. Each exoneration was a miracle and an indictment, proof that the system could self-correct and proof that it failed far too often. After the speech, a young woman approached Amelia tentatively. She was maybe 25, with nervous eyes and hands that wouldn't stay still. "Miss Taylor? I wanted to thank you. My brother was convicted 3 years ago for armed robbery. He maintained his innocence, but his public defender barely put up a defense. Your organization helped us get a new lawyer, helped us investigate, and last month the charges were dropped. Security footage proved he was somewhere else when the robbery happened. He's home now. He's rebuilding his life. And it's because of you." Amelia felt the familiar sting of tears. She'd heard stories like this dozens of times, and they never got old, never stopped mattering. "It's not because of me," she said gently. "It's because your brother was innocent, and you refused to stop fighting for him. That's what makes the difference. People who won't give up on the truth." The young woman hugged her, fierce and quick, then disappeared back into the crowd. Amelia watched her go and thought about all the people she'd never meet, never know about, whose lives had been touched by the ripples spreading outward from that terrible November evening 16 years ago. 15 years later, Amelia retired from teaching at 63, though retirement was a generous term for what she actually did, which was continue advocating, continue speaking, continue showing up for people who needed someone to believe them. She published a book, The Evidence of Innocence, that became required reading in criminal justice programs across the country. She traveled for speaking engagements, sharing her story and listening to others share theirs. The jade plant was massive now, almost a small tree, with branches that had to be pruned regularly to keep it manageable. She'd given away dozens of cuttings over the years, each one a piece of hope transplanted into someone else's life. Students, colleagues, friends, even strangers she'd met briefly. All had received propagated stems with instructions for care and the story of what this particular plant represented. Elena was finishing high school, brilliant and fierce and determined to study law. "I want to be like Grandma," she'd announced last Thanksgiving, and Amelia had cried into her mashed potatoes. The idea that her suffering had created this legacy, a granddaughter who believed in justice, who wanted to fight for the vulnerable, felt almost miraculous. Zara had given birth to a son 2 years ago, naming him Benjamin with the Morrisons' blessing. Little Benjamin was wild and joyful, obsessed with space exploration and asking questions that exhausted everyone around him. Carolyn Morrison visited regularly, her face lighting up in ways it hadn't in decades when she held the boy who carried her son's name. "It doesn't replace him," Carolyn had said the first time she'd held baby Benjamin. "Nothing could, but it honors him. It says his name still matters, that he's still part of our lives even though he's gone." On a cold March afternoon, Amelia received a letter from Sarah Chin. They'd corresponded sporadically over the years. Awkward, painful exchanges that nonetheless felt necessary. Sarah's parole hearing was coming up, and she'd asked Amelia to provide a victim impact statement. Amelia sat with the request for days, unsure how to respond. Sarah had destroyed months of her life, had planted evidence that could have led to decades in prison. And yet, Sarah's confession had also saved her, had provided the truth when continuing to lie would have been easier. Finally, Amelia wrote a letter that tried to hold space for complexity. She described the trauma of false accusation, the ongoing impact of public condemnation, the ways her life had been irreparably changed. But she also wrote about Sarah's courage in telling the truth, about the importance of accountability and redemption, about her belief that people were more than their worst actions. "I do not forgive easily," she wrote, "and I will not forget what you did. But I also recognize that you've served your time, that you've expressed genuine remorse, and that you helped bring truth to light when you could have remained silent. If you're granted parole, I hope you'll use your freedom to become someone who fights against the kind of desperation that led you to make terrible choices. I hope you'll become someone who protects vulnerable people instead of victimizing them. That would be the truest form of redemption." Sarah was granted parole 6 months later. Amelia didn't attend the hearing, but she heard about it through Maria, who'd kept tabs on the case. Sarah moved to a halfway house in Pittsburgh, got a job at a grocery store, started volunteering at a domestic violence shelter. She sent Amelia a note. "Thank you for giving me a chance I didn't deserve. I won't waste it." 20 years later, on the 20th anniversary of her arrest, Amelia woke in her own bed, in her own house, surrounded by plants and photographs and evidence of a life rebuilt. She was 68 years old, healthy, engaged, purposeful. The nightmare that had once threatened to consume her was now just part of her history, important but no longer defining. She spent the morning in her garden, tending to vegetables and checking on the fruit trees she'd planted years ago. The jade plant sat in its place of honor on the patio, enormous and thriving, its leaves catching the autumn sunlight. She touched one of the thick branches gently, remembering the broken stems, the crisis moment when she'd thought it might not survive. "We made it," she whispered to the plant. "Both of us." Elena called from law school, excited about a case she was working on through her clinic, a potential wrongful conviction that had all the hallmarks of planted evidence and coerced confession. "Grandma, I need your advice," she said, and Amelia spent an hour on the phone walking her granddaughter through the questions to ask, the evidence to gather, the ways to build a case for innocence. After the call, Amelia sat on her patio and thought about legacy. Not the big, public kind, the documentary, the book, the project that bore her name, but the small, intimate kind. A granddaughter who believed in justice, a grandson who asked questions without fear, a community of people she'd helped who were now helping others. Benjamin Morrison stopped by in the afternoon with fresh-baked cookies and the news that Richard's cancer was in remission. They sat together in comfortable silence, two women who'd been strangers until tragedy bound them together, who'd learned that healing happened in relationship, that forgiveness was a practice rather than a destination. "Do you ever wonder what your life would have been like if none of this had happened?" Carolyn asked. Amelia considered the question. "Sometimes, but I can't imagine being anyone other than who I am now. The suffering wasn't worth it. I wouldn't choose it again. But the person I became because of it, I think I like her. I think she does good work." "She does," Carolyn agreed. "She does extraordinary work." As the sun set over Philadelphia, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, Amelia thought about Benjamin Morrison, dead for 38 years but never forgotten. She thought about all. The other Benjamins, the lost children, the wrongly convicted, the people failed by systems meant to protect them. She thought about hope, not as a naive belief that everything would be okay, but as a deliberate choice to keep trying, keep fighting, keep growing toward the light. In her living room, surrounded by family photographs and propagated plants, sat a small glass case. Inside was a dinosaur patch carefully preserved, the same one that had been on Benjamin Morrison's backpack. The Morrisons had given it to her years ago, a symbol of connection and shared memory. Next to it was a button from her old cardigan, the one that had provided the evidence of her guilt. And beside that, a small cutting from the jade plant, rooted in water, ready to be planted and given away. Symbols of suffering and survival, loss and resilience, arranged together to tell a story that refused easy conclusions. A story that reminded her, and anyone who saw it, that innocence mattered, that truth was worth fighting for, and that hope, properly tended, could survive almost anything. Amelia stood and turned on the lights as darkness fell. Somewhere in the city, someone was being falsely accused. Somewhere, a family was grieving an unsolved loss. Somewhere, the machinery of justice was grinding forward, sometimes toward truth, sometimes away from it. But also somewhere, a lawyer was reviewing evidence with fresh eyes. An investigator was asking difficult questions. A student was learning to think critically about conviction and proof. And a woman who'd survived the unthinkable was preparing to help them, to share what she'd learned, to stand beside them in their own dark hours. The jade plant caught the light from the window, its leaves glossy and strong. Hope multiplied, resilience spread, and life, stubborn and beautiful and imperfect, continued its slow, patient work of healing. 23 years after that November evening when police knocked on her door, Amelia Taylor stood before a United Nations Committee on Human Rights. sharing her story as part of a global initiative on criminal justice reform. The room was filled with representatives from dozens of countries, each grappling with their own versions of wrongful conviction and systemic failure. She spoke about the jade plant, about how it had become her symbol of survival. She spoke about the importance of second chances, not just for the wrongly accused, but for the systems that failed them, the people who made mistakes, the communities that rushed to judgment. We cannot eliminate human error, she concluded, but we can build systems that acknowledge fallibility, that include multiple checks and balances, that value truth over convenience. We can create cultures that resist the rush to judgment, that remember the humanity of the accused. We can choose, every day, to be people who question, who dig deeper, who refuse to accept easy answers when lives hang in the balance. The speech received a standing ovation. But more importantly, it sparked conversations that continued long after she'd left the podium. Representatives approached her with stories from their own countries, seeking advice, building networks, creating alliances across borders and languages. On the flight home, Amelia looked out at clouds stretching to the horizon and thought about distance. How far she traveled, literally and metaphorically, from that November evening. How the woman she'd been then would barely recognize the woman she'd become. She thought about a quote from Maya Angelou that had sustained her through the darkest times. There is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside you. She told her story over and over until it transformed from wound into weapon. A tool for fighting injustice, for illuminating the cracks in the system, for reminding people that behind every arrest record was a complete human being. When she arrived home, Elena and young Benjamin were waiting with a banner that read, "Welcome home, Grandma," and cookies that were slightly burned but made with love. Zara hugged her tightly, and they stood together in the doorway, 3 generations of survival and resilience. The jade plant on the patio had put out new growth, tiny leaves unfurling toward the light. Hope renewed itself, season after season, asking nothing but patience and care. And Amelia, 68 years old and finally at peace, knew that she'd done what seemed impossible on that terrible November evening. She'd survived, she'd thrived, and she'd transformed her suffering into something that helped others survive their own dark hours. That was legacy. That was justice. That was hope made manifest. Subscribe to your channel, where silence is never forgotten.